How's it going, everybody? Matt here again from East Coast Sabers, and today we're going to be doing a little kind of just a what's the word I'm looking for, just kind of a little fix to the Let's Build a Graflex series. I've had a lot of people not really complain, but request that I show how to wire up a red button activation in the Graflex 2.0 with the provided switches and all the material. So today I'm going to do that. It's just going to be a short video. I'm going to do it as quickly as possible, just focusing on the red button activation. I have, as you can see, a Goth 3D Designs Padawan chassis and a Nano Biscotti version 3 that I'm going to be putting into this 2.0. I'm not going to go over any of that in the video. I'm just going to skip over it. And it's just going to be focusing on the red button activation using the standard switch that is included with the kit, as well as the standard red button. Now I have painted this red button a darker red, just using some spray paint, so it still works perfectly normal. You don't have to worry about trying to figure out how to get one to work. One of the plastic replacements or anything like that. And as you can see, it's still even painted. It drops right in, pops right out. So today we're going to go over how to install that, how to wire it up. And the first thing you have to do is disassemble the saber to get the inner core out. Now I've already covered that in the Let's Build a Graflex series, so I'm just going to go ahead and do that, and we'll cut back once it's all apart. Okay, so now as you can see, I have the whole saber disassembled. I have the inner core out. So now we can begin the inner core modifications for the rest of the build. As you can see, this is a Graflex 2.1, not the older 2.0, because it has the slot in the side for clamp activation, and it has the step on the inside. How you can see how it's a larger diameter here and a smaller diameter further inside. That means it is a 2.1 style, as well as the threaded 632 hole here and here for the I believe they're for the Parks sabers, to make it easier for Park to install his electronics. But we are going to be installing different electronics, so what we're going to have to do is I'm still going to drill and tap an 8/32 hole right about here for the LED retention system, and I'm going to increase this hole from a 632 to an 832 for my chassis retention system. My chassis will, of course, excuse me, slide right in, and it'll sit something like that. So it'll just have a set screw that just rests on this part, and that's what will retain the chassis in place. But since the board is back here and the red button sits pretty much right underneath here, or right on top of this, I'm sorry, we have this channel here for wires, but we have no other way to get the wiring down to the soundboard once the shroud is on. So what we're going to have to do is carve a channel inside the ribbed section here on top and drill a hole leading in. Now on the Padawan chassis, it doesn't really matter how far you drill the hole. On the Goth 3D Designs Knight chassis, it does, because the battery holder comes so far up into the inner core that Rick over at Goth 3D Designs has designed a special hole in the battery holder itself for the wires to pass through. And you're going to want to do that, drill that hole right here, right in between the second and the third rib. So you're going to have to mill out a channel between the first two and then drill a hole in between the second and third. Very simple to do. But on this chassis, it doesn't really matter. The only thing we need to do is make sure we go low enough that we go past where the LED will sit. And I have my LED module right here. Put that out of the way. So the LED system, which this is one of the older ones, I'm going to have to shave this down. This is one of the older ones from TCSS, before they changed the inner size of the 2.1, so these ones were for the older 2.0s. They're a little big, but with just a little bit of sanding, even I'm going to put this on my lathe, but even with a little bit of sanding, you can get these down so they fit really nicely. So I'm going to want to get proper blade insertion, I'm going to want my LED to sit just beyond the lower retention hole, which the lower blade retention hole sits there. So I want my LED to sit something like this. So we'll sit right about there. So I'm still going to go in between the second and third rib for my wire passage hole. So that means all I have to do is carve a channel on the first two ribs and drill a hole there. Now the way that I used to do it is I just use my Dremel to carve the channel, and you just fire it up and just make a groove in the top of the ribs, make it deep enough for a couple wires to sit through, and I always heat shrink mine to make sure that they don't get cut up or anything on the sharp edges. I try not to have any sharp edges, but if you do, a little bit of heat shrink helps protect the wires. So just a small hole here and a channel here, and that should do it. So I'm going to go ahead and chuck this up in my drill press slash makeshift milling machine, and we'll continue from there. Okay, so now we're set up in my drill press slash makeshift milling machine. It's not the recommended way to mill something, but I take very light passes, so it works without putting too much stress and side load on the bearings inside the head of the drill press. So hopefully this works. I've chosen a milling end mill that is pretty much the same size, just a hair shorter than the wire passage that is designed in the 2.0. As you can see, it sits right down in. So all I'm going to do is move it over, and I'm just going to mill a section out of these two ribs, and we're going to call that good, and then just drill a hole right down here. So let's do that now. Alright, so we have our channel milled out. It came out very nice. I went pretty deep with this one. Again, you don't have to go super deep. I mean, you figure this channel up here is not deep at all, and that's plenty. I just go a little extra deep just because I think it looks good. I'm gonna, after I drill the hole, I will take out my little file and just take off some of the sharp edges. But for now, I'm just going to drop this down and drill a hole for the wire passage. Alright, so I have my drill bit chucked up. The mill that I used was a 1/4 inch, so I'm using a 1/4 inch drill bit. I'm just giving the same size hole as the channel. Now the problem with drilling into the inner cores is due to the shape of the ribs, it makes it very difficult for the drill bit to not wobble and jump all over the place. Even in a nice secured drill press, the drill bits still have a bit of flex to them just due to the length of the drill bit. This is a brand new, very sharp cobalt drill bit. I've never used this one, so I'm hoping that it bites right in and I don't have any problems. But if you see it kind of jumping around, it's kind of unavoidable unless I mill down everything so that it's perfectly flat, and I don't feel like doing that. So it might jump and chatter just a little bit, but hopefully it won't be too bad, and hopefully we can just plow right through it. So let's see how it goes. And that's it. That actually worked out very, very well. No real jumping or chattering or anything like that. And I think it looks pretty good. So let's take it out and just get a better look at it. So as you can see, we have our nice hole. I will clean up the burrs on the inside. Of course, when you do this, you want to take some sandpaper and sand it from the inside to get rid of any burrs that are on the inside. And like I said, I'm going to take my file and clean up any of these sharp edges. But we have a nice large 1/4 inch hole, a nice large 1/4 inch deep channel, and I think that'll work. Okay, while I have this at the drill press, I'm just going to go ahead and also drill the retention hole for the LED. This is the bit that comes with the 832 drill and tap set from TCSS. So I'm just going to go ahead and drill that. I've lined it up with my blade retention holes to make sure that it's nice and centered. I flip it around so it's on the bottom side so that it doesn't interfere with the wire passage going to the red button. Excuse me, the red button. So I just flip it over. I have it pretty well lined up. Maybe come back just a hair. Yeah, something like that. So we'll just go ahead and drill that hole. Simple as that. Now I'm also, while I'm here, if I have enough throw on this thing, what I want to do is I just want to drill this out a little more. This is a 632 hole for the retention system that Parks uses. I prefer to use an 832 set screw hole. So I'm just going to enlarge this just a tad. Simple as that. Okay, I'm all set up in the vise here. Now what I'm going to do is I have these 2 holes drilled. This is for the lower blade retention screw, either your second red button or your glass eye. That is for the shroud. This is the hole we just drilled for the LED retention. That one is unused. That is the one that comes in it, and this is the one that we just enlarged. So I'm just going to tap these real quick using the 832 tap that I got from TCSS, and I'm just putting just a tiny bit of WD-40 in there just to help the tap go in without any problems. I'm just going to go in a little bit, back it off, kind of move it around, thread it in a couple more. It gets tight, back it out, kind of spin it, keep going, a couple more, gets tight, back it out, thread it back in, it gets tight, you back it out, kind of move it around, let the chips kind of naturally work their way out through the top of the hole. And that's it. Now we can just thread it in. I like to thread them in quite a ways just to make sure that they're nice and clean. And I blow them out from the inside. I just don't like the chips working their way back up through the hole, potentially damaging the threads. So that hole is done. Just going to wipe off my tap. Clean off the hole. My compressor is not on or charged at the moment, so normally I have compressed air that I blow these out with. You can get just a can of compressed air from any computer electronics store. Just get the cans of air for cleaning electronics. It works really well for cleaning. debris from stuff if you don't want to spend the money on a compressor. And I'm just going to do the same thing to this hole. This one's easier because it's not a lot of material at all, so it doesn't take much at all to tap. Just make sure that you do go in nice and straight, as the thinner holes will tend to easily tap at an angle, which will make, of course, your set screw thread in at an angle, which you don't really want. So that one's tapped already. That one's simple. Not a lot of material there. Clean off the tap again. Clean that off, and like I said, I will go in with some sandpaper, because as you can see, we do have quite a bit of metal on the inside. So you do want to clean out from the inside, and you also want to take either some Scotch-Brite or a file or some sandpaper and clean off all the burrs on the inside for all of the holes we've drilled. Make sure that the inside is nice and clean. You don't want any sharp metal catching any wires or making it difficult for the LED module or the chassis to go in. So just make sure everything's nice and clean. So right now we will pull this out. And as you can see, we have one hole drilled and tapped. We have the second hole enlarged and tapped. And on the other side we have our large hole with our wire passage, and I will clean that out from the inside a little more, but that's about it. I will go ahead and continue with the rest of the saber assembly, and we'll come back when it's time to wire up and install the red button, which is virtually one of my very last steps. I do everything else back here, wire up everything else, run all the wiring up to this, and then the red button will be the last step. But I will make sure that I demonstrate how the wires are run, how I do it, how I secure them before I put the shroud back on and do the final assembly for the red button. So we'll come back when it's time to do that. Alright everybody, we are back at the bench. As you can see, I have the whole rest of the saber completed except for final assembly and my red button. I always save the red button for last because you want to do it as you're putting the shroud on. But I have the whole rest of the saber done, soundboard's wired up. I have tested everything, soundboard and everything works perfectly. So now we can just go ahead and get right into the button assembly. And I'm not going to go over final installation because I've already covered that in one of my other videos. But today we're just going to focus on assembling the red button. So before we actually do that with the shroud, as you can see, if I zoom in a little bit here, and we'll just move some of this stuff out of the way. There we go. As you can see, I have my nice channel milled out, lined up with where the button's going to go. Now we could just do this and just let it sit there, but I don't really care to do that. So I have just a little piece of black heat shrink, and I'm just going to slide it over my wires. As you can see, my wires are ridiculously long. Having trouble talking today. And that's because I always just like to have a lot of excess. It's better to have too much than not enough. So there. Sorry I did that off camera. We'll just slide it over the wires. Slide it down into the hole a little bit. And I like to not have it just sitting like that. I like to put it in the hole so that way it protects from the back side as well, because there is a sharp edge on the back side. I did file it down, but just to be safe, I like to make sure that the wire is always protected from any and all sharp edges. So now I'll just fire up my heat gun. We'll just shrink this up real quick. And while it is soft, I will hold it in place and wait for it to cool, and when it cools, as you can see, it stays in place a lot better. So from here, we have our wire, which is still very long. And we now have the wire a little bit protected from the sharp edges. Again, I sanded these down, I filed them down so they're not really sharp anymore. But I just like to be extra safe. Now, sometimes what you can do is you can, and I think I am going to do it. I wasn't going to, but I think I will, just to be safe. I'm going to take just a little E6000. Just a little bit on the tip of a toothpick, and I'm just gonna apply it to the bottom of the groove. Doesn't really matter if this looks kind of messy, you're never gonna see it once the shroud goes on. And I'm just gonna lay the wire down into it. Use a little flat blade to really smoosh it down. I'm just going to hold that there for a second. Kind of mush it around the edges. Just give it a couple seconds to at least start to dry, start to cure a little bit. E6000 is always kind of rubbery and it takes a little bit to fully cure. But it can get good enough pretty fast. Once it hits the open air, it does start to dry out pretty quickly. There, it's not really moving. Okay, so I'm going to just hold that down. So the next step is going to be to put the shroud on. And the wire is going to come up through obviously the big hole for the red button. So we don't want the wire sticking out when we put the shroud on because it's going to cut the wire. So what I do is I feed it through the threaded hole, which is unused unless you're using that hole for blade retention. So I will route both wires through the hole and out the front. Keep making sure they stay nice and flush, nice and flat, and they're not going to get pinched or cut when we put the shroud on. So now it's as simple as taking your wiring, slide it through first. Now again, you want to make sure that it comes out the front. You don't want it to come through the hole. You don't want it to go through the side hole either. That's what mine just did. Make sure it just comes out the front. This one's giving me trouble. There we go. And just slide your shroud into place. As you can see, our hole is nice and lined up. Now what I do to keep everything in place is I'm just going to take one of my little Allen screws. This is going to get replaced with a slotted screw, but just for now I'm just going to put this slotted screw into the bottom hole. I'm sorry, this Allen screw, not slotted screw, into the lower emitter hole, just to keep the shroud from moving around. Just snug it down a little bit. There we go. And then I'm just going to take a screwdriver, just very lightly, very gently, lift up on the wire so you can pull them out. Okay, so now we have our wires coming out the top of the hole. We have our switch bezel, our red button bezel. We have our red button, again, which I have painted to be a darker color than just the red anodized. I sanded it and painted it. And we have our switch with the PCB board attached. Why is that not focusing? There we go. So you can buy these switches aftermarket. You can get them from eBay all over the place, but they don't come with the PCB board, and it makes it more difficult to install. And they also don't have the little round pads on the bottom, which is what we are going to be using to solder to. So I like the ones from the kit for this particular install. It just makes it easier with the board attached to the bottom of it. So what I'm going to do now is somewhere, I can't remember exactly where I put it. Ah, there it is. I have my new flat beer tab. And, oh, that's my accurate slide switch screw. Put that off to the side. But I do have my new accurate beer tab from KR Sabers. So I'm going to be putting that on. And I have my original flat top screw and the washer. And what I'm actually going to do right now is, because this washer is meant for the bent, the angled beer tab, and it's meant to sit up, so this washer is meant to go underneath it, so it's a little thick if you go with the flat one. So what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to make a new washer, because I don't really have a good way to accurately and smoothly grind this down to the right size, so I'm just going to make a new one on my lathe, and we'll come right back after I do that. Alright, and we are back, and I have my new accurate, or I shouldn't say accurate, but my better sized spacer for my beer tab screw. Now again, this isn't, you don't need a smaller one if you're using the stock angled beer tab. If you're using the angled beer tab, then you just use the screw and spacer that comes with it. If you're switching over to a flat style beer tab, which is more vintage accurate, you will want a smaller one. Now you can just file the stock one. If you have a small file, you can just file it down. That works fine. I don't really, I'd rather just make my own. It's a little easier than filing it and trying to get it perfectly straight. So I just went that route, but it's not a necessity. So now that I have that, I can put on the beer tab, and I can't remember. No, they both, it seems to be the same finish on both sides. I wasn't sure if there was a shiny side and a dull side, but there doesn't seem to be. And slide the spacer over, and then you're going to want to slide your beer tab over the bezel, the switch housing, bezel, whatever you want to call it. And you're going to want to feed your wires up through the switch housing. And then start the rear screw threads, making sure, always make sure before you do this, look down inside the hole, and I'm going to pull that back off for a second. I'm going to get my little light, whoops, and always try and see down inside the hole and make sure your wires are not getting pinched, because your switch wires run right past the threaded hole for that beer tab retention screw. So you really don't want any wires in the way that are going to get pinched by the screw. So I'm going to just get a small, very tiny screwdriver real quick. Okay. And I'm just going to make sure, just push these wires out of the way a little bit. Make sure that the wires are not in the hole, because you really don't want to pinch those. We've done everything we can to make sure the wires don't get damaged up to this point, and we'd hate for it to be at this very last step. So again, route the wires through the bezel, if they will. And start that screw. Now what I usually do is, right now I have this bottom screw kind of tight. I will loosen it up to let the inner core kind of flop around. That makes it even easier to tighten down this rear screw. And I will turn it down as I, there, and that's pretty tight. And then when you finally tighten this bottom one, it'll put tension on the top one and really do a good job of locking it in. So now that that's in, now we can just start our red button bezel, tighten that down, and now we have our, actually, you know what, that screw is not all the way down, so we'll loosen that back up. I'm actually going to pull this off. Keep spinning this until, there we go. Now it's getting tight. As you can see, now the screw is much more evenly seated, and it's getting really tight. So then the nice thing about these beer tabs is they are thin, so they're easily bent up. You just gotta be careful not to put a crease in them when you bend them, because it will be visible. And then just slide the red button housing, bezel, housing, whatever you want to call it. Now the threads for the red button can be finicky. Sometimes they go in really tight. Other times they go right in. Like this one's actually being fairly cooperative. There we go. I could have gone a little smaller on that spacer. If you look at a vintage though, it doesn't sit perfectly flush. It isn't a bent beer tab, it is straight, but it does have a spacer underneath, and it does sit up at an angle like that. So that is actually semi-accurate to a vintage one. Whoops. Try not to let it try not to let it roll away. They tend to do that sometimes. So now we're coming up on the final part of this, which is soldering the red button on and putting the cap on. And I think that's the part that most people have the most trouble with. And that's the part they really want to see how to do, and do kind of the best way. I can't say that it's the correct way, because there are no directions or anything with this kit. It's kind of just make it up as you go along. But I've done it this way many times, and I've never had a problem. So what happens is, when it comes to soldering these switches, people get confused as to where you solder to, whether it's the 4 prongs, the 2 in the middle, and the answer is both. You can solder to either or. As you can see, you have the 2 dots and you have the 4 legs, and if you look, you can see the discoloration underneath the PCB board material, and that's the bridging that connects them. So these 2 prongs are connected to that center pad, and the top 2 prongs are connected to that center pad. So you can go to, let me get a screwdriver. You can solder onto this leg or this leg. You can solder from this leg to this leg, this leg to this leg, this leg to this leg, or you can go from the 2 middle ones. What you don't want to do is you don't want to solder from here to here, because as you can see, they're all connected. So if you solder from this one to this one, you have an completed circuit all the time, and when you pull your kill key out, all it's going to do is continuously cycle between sound fonts, because it's registering as the button's continuously pressed down, because it's a continuously closed circuit. Same with if you connected the bottom two prongs. So always make sure that you go from top to bottom. It doesn't matter which one you go to, crossways, up and down, you just can't go side to side. So if you hold it like this, if you have one of the aftermarket switches which doesn't have the two center prongs, just always make sure that you go top to bottom, not side to side. So with this one though, we're going to go from the two middle prongs to make it easier, because I don't want any metal touching the inside diameter of our switch housing, because that will complete the circuit, that'll ground out the switch. So I'm going to cut these, if it'll focus, come on. I'm going to cut the little legs off, and we're going to solder to the two middle ones. So that really kind of saves any aggravation or any confusion you may have. So I'm just going to take them and I'm going to cut them as close to the material as I can. Now I have some special snips that are completely flat on the backside that allow for flush cutting. If you don't have any, I recommend getting some. They work great. They're hobby snips and hobby wire snips. They work great for the small gauge wire we work with. They're great for making smooth, flat cuts. As you can see, that's pretty good. Those are pretty smooth. I don't think I have to worry about those. But me being the careful person that I am, I'm going to take just my small hobby file, and I'm just going to file them a little smoother. Again, it doesn't really matter what the bottom of the switch looks like if you kind of scratch it up, because you're never going to see it. There, I like those ones a lot better. You can use sandpaper too, it doesn't matter. There. Those are a lot smoother, a lot more flush, and not bad. We don't really have to worry about those contacting any metal. So I'm going to put that off to the side. So now we have our two wires that are sticking out, and this is the part that really gets kind of tricky, because you want to make sure that your wiring is not bound up when you put the switch in. So there is a way to do that, and be careful, being careful when you do it. It's not too bad. So what I'm going to do is, what you're going to want to do is cut your wires as close to the switch housing as possible, because the more wire that you have hanging out, that's the more wire you have to try and stuff inside. So the tricky part is, if you don't want to leave your chassis disconnected, that's one thing you can do, is leave the chassis disconnected, and then you can pull the excess back inside the hilt. But since we put our heat shrink in the groove and glued it down, that's not really an option for us, because I like to be safe. So I don't have a problem with just cutting my wires very short. That way I only have just a little bit to coil up inside there, and we're not just going to shove the wire in. You'll see when in just a minute, we're going to gently coil it up inside under the switch, so that it's not all bent and tangled and risks breaking, but it'll be nicely, neatly coiled. So what I'm going to do is, I'm just going to hold my switch kind of like this. Excuse me. I am going to get my helping hands, take that out, and I'm just going to hold the switch in the helping hands. I'm going to prop that up, something like that, and I'm just going to get my wire as close to those pads as possible. And I'm going to cut them as short as possible while still being able to solder onto them. All right. And I'm just going to strip off just a small piece of sheathing. Both wires. There we go. All right. Turn my soldering iron on and wait for that to heat up for just a quick second. And my iron is now hot. I'm just going to pre-tin the tip a little bit. And I'm going to zoom in here just a tad. Kind of rearrange, get it in camera a little better. I'm just going to pre-tin the wire. And I'm going to bring my switch back in. And what I'm actually going to do is I'm actually going to pre-tin the pad as well. There we go. Tip is dirty. Now it's as simple. Now that the pad is pre-tinned, the wires are pre-tinned, all we really have to do is I'm going to use my little piece of, my little alligator clip here. I'm just going to lay it over the switch, kind of facing the inside so that the wire doesn't have to bend to the outside, if that makes any sense at all. I am going to pre-tin the tip of my iron a little bit. Now again, with momentary switches like this, or with basically any switch, unless it's a illuminated switch, it doesn't matter which pad you go to, as long as the circuit can flow between them. So it doesn't matter which pad is what. Wow, that is not the best solder joint. I can get the wire keeps bending away. There, that's better. Alligator clip flattened it just a bit, but that doesn't matter. Sheathing's good. I'm just going to cut off that excess. All right. So I'm going to do the same thing to the black wire. And I'm just going to lay it across the pad. Let it cool. Do a quick pull test. That one's good. That one's good. And then if this thing could stop rolling for 2 seconds. And then I'm just going to do another quick test, make sure it works. Again, do a test after every step you do to make sure that everything works, because if you don't and all of a sudden something stops working, you don't know if it was the last step you did or 10 steps ago. So I always make sure that everything works after every step. Pull the kill key. And everything works. We are getting a few phantom swings for the first sound bank of the Nano Biscotti, but that's because the battery is really low. I haven't charged it since I finished the install, so that's not a problem. But the switch works. Everything's good there. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take just a dab, just a teeny tiny little dot of glue. You can use super glue, you can use really anything you want. I like E6000 because it's not entirely permanent like a lot of other super glues are. I'm going to put it just on the tip of the switch, right on the top of the hat, the switch hat as they call it. You don't want too much because it will ooze out. And then I'm just going to put the switch cap right over it. And we're just going to hold that there for a second. And while that's drying, I am going to put the kill key back in. Because you will have to be pushing the button a few times. I'm going to push it down just to really get it to seat. And I don't want the saber turning on and off and on and off. So I think that'll do it for that. So now I am going to use a little bit more E6000. And what we're going to do now is I'm going to put it over the solder joints. And this is going to act as kind of an insulant. I'm not even sure that's a word. Insulator, that's the word I'm looking for. Insulant. And it's just going to help protect the pads and the open solder joints from any metal. Kind of work it around. What it's also going to do is you don't really want to get it too close to the edges because then it will fill the cavity, the switch cavity, or the inside of the switch housing, I should say. I'm sorry about that. That is my sump pump kicking on because my basement has a lot of water in it. So now that we have a decent amount of E6000 on the bottom of the switch, I'm going to coil my wire. Just twist it as you're pushing it into the switch housing. And again, this will keep it nice and coiled. And it won't pinch the wiring as it goes in to the housing. It'll neatly coil up. As you can see, it worked perfectly. It is nice and neatly coiled. It comes out more in a coil also. It's nice and protected. It's not pinched at all. And the E6000 that I put on the bottom of the switch is not quite protruding enough to catch the switch. So I'm going to put just a dab in the bottom of the switch housing. You don't want to get too much on the sides because it will catch the red button. It'll catch the cap and it'll make the cap stick. When you don't want that because you want a nice tactile feel to the switch. You just want enough that it will catch the bottom of the PCB board and cause it to stay down. So coiling up the wire again, we push it down. And we're just going to hold the button for a second. You can see we still have a nice tactile feel. You can still hear the switch, and it's staying down a lot nicer. So we're just going to hold it here for a second. There we go. I think that's about enough. We still have our tactile feel. And if we pull the kill key out, as you can see, the red button protrudes just a little bit above the bezel, which is what you want. You don't want it to sit down flush with the top. You don't want it to sit way up and look kind of goofy. You want it to sit just like that. This setup is designed so that the button will sit perfectly when the switch is installed from the top down. Some people put the switch underneath the bezel, and then your red button doesn't sit properly. But like this, works just like it's supposed to. So that's it for the red button, guys. It's all installed, and right now I'm just going to go ahead and complete the rest of the installation on this one. I still have to put grips on and finish the other accuracies that I'm going to do, but this video was just meant for the red button, and that part is done. Again, a lot of ghost swings because of the low battery. But that's it, everybody. Red button installation on a Graflex 2.0 using all original kit included pieces. I hope this was helpful. I hope it was educational. If you have any questions, of course, feel free to message me either through here. You can email me at eastcoastsabersusa@gmail.com. You can find me on Facebook at facebook.com/eastcoastsabersusa. And if you were doing your own build and you're looking for advice and people to talk to, always hit up the Graflex Addicts support group on Facebook. I am the admin there, so feel free to stop by, share your thoughts, and I hope everybody has a good day. Thank you for watching, and may the force be with you.